late 1952, Dwight David Eisenhower was the President of the United States, commonly known as Ike, the commander of the forces on D-Day, became president and elected in 1952, sworn in early 1953. At that same time, if you happen to remember Tennessee history, Frank Clement was the governor back then. He and Buford Arlington used to take turns running for office because there was a 2-year limit, but no limit on the number of terms cumulatively, so they just took turns. Well, he was it back in 1952. And it was Frank Goad Clement, G-O-A-D. That's one of the strangest names I've ever seen. And back at the same time, late 1952, a group of a few boys, age 14 to 18, got together in the backyard of John Buhler, who lived on Central, right where there's a parking lot across from the music building now, and formed what they called the Teenage Astronomy Club. And this was written up by Bob Ritter, who was one of the founding members of it, and the various people are listed here who were the founding members of this down here at the bottom. John Buhler, president, presumably because he had the largest telescope, and Bob Ritter, the vice president, and Tom Herzog was the treasurer. They would meet in their backyard or in the garage sometime if they were building things. In 1953, sometime between late 52 and early 53, they ditched the term Teenage Astronomy Club. Somebody must have given them some good advice, and otherwise we'd be totally out of business right now. So the group was opened up to older members or even younger ones, at least for visitation purposes.
Bill?
Yes?
Who could write that article?
Yeah, this article, yes, Liddell Sims wrote this. And this article came out in the summer of 1953 in August, along with the Perseid New Year shower. And back in those days, the Commercial Appeal and the Memphis Press-Scimitar, the afternoon paper, used to put quite a bit of effort into community news, scientific organizations, and it's just a whole different world back then. As you'll see shortly, for this one particular thing, the Perseid New Year shower in August 1953, they had 5 pictures and 17 column inches of material in addition to this article. This was just a humorous article that was always on the front page of the paper every day. Liddell Sims wrote that, and he was an excellent writer, but he just kind of did feature stories. It wasn't really any kind of a serious article, and most of the time he spent talking about the fact that we didn't have any girls in the group then, and how eventually they would get starstruck and they would see the lights in the sky better than the Perseid meteor shower ever dreamed of. So that was the front page article, and then there were a bunch more that we'll take a look at later. So a couple of months later, in October 1953, a group of 5 people got together. John Buhler, L.S. Hartzog, Tommy Hartzog, who was actually the young member then, L.S. was his father, Bob Ritter, and Milton Buhler, who was the father of John Buhler. Those of you who are really old, you might remember Hart's Bakery. Well, L.S. Hartzog was Hart's Bakery, and Milton Buhler was the president of Dixie Lily Flour Company, so I imagine they knew each other in that regard. If you look here at the purpose of the Memphis Astronomical Society, for the purpose of studying and advancing the general interest of the community in astronomy, the science which treats of the celestial bodies, of their positions, magnitudes, motions, distances, constitution, physical condition, their mutual relations, their history, and their destiny. It's pretty all-encompassing, and that's our goal. This was our stated goal in our charter of incorporation. And on the last page of it, you can see that this was submitted on October 24th, 1953. So we could have done this, as I was telling Tim, we could have had this in October, because that was when the charter was filed, but it was finally approved and signed and sealed and made official on November 13th, 1953. So we're right in between that span right now, so we can actually have a 3-week-long festival if we want to and celebrate our 60th anniversary. Let's see. And he's shown in the middle right here, and he's also in the back of the room. And at this point, I would like to introduce John and have him come up and narrate a few of these pictures, which are his anyway. So John, you come on up.
Sit right here. You got a pointer that might help.
Okay, and I'll advance them whenever you
Thank you.
call for it.
Sure.
Before he gets going, we owe a great deal of gratitude to John for founding this organization and giving us all 60 years of enjoyment and pleasure and hard work and all of that. So thank you very much.
I will say one thing, it wasn't that difficult to get started because back then there wasn't much else to do except to have hobbies. No television and no internet and no computers and things like that. So all of us had a bunch of hobbies, and we were encouraged by our parents to have those hobbies because they felt like it'd keep us out of trouble and down on the farm, you know, so to speak. So this was one that I got interested in, as well as some of our friends from East High School, and we decided to form the society. But that's kind of the reason. That was just one of the hobbies that we had back then. Just a little aside. Do you want me to point at these people?
All right, sure. Yeah.
I might just say that this gentleman right here, Bob Allred, he was probably the oldest member of the group. He had been in the Navy and was a flight instructor. He taught me how to fly, matter of fact. And this is Bob Ritter, who was one of the founders. And this was a 6-inch telescope that we had here that we used in the backyard. And one of the things that Bill said, that maybe one of the reasons I was first president, not only did I have a telescope, but we used my backyard. So that's please go ahead.
I have a question. Was that back of the screen? Had a picture of a meteor there.
Yeah.
Is that one that you took? Or you
Yeah, we were into photography, astronomical photography, and although I'm not sure, looking back, that was actually taken during the Perseid meteor shower. It's what we submitted to the paper and they used. So, and this was Phil Wright, who was one of the members. That's Bob Ritter again, and this was over actually at Bob Ritter's house one afternoon. I mean, one evening. This was my backyard, Bob Ritter and me, and that 6-inch telescope that we had. And this was just a picture that we took. We ground some mirrors, and not too many, but as I recall, 2 or 3. And this was kind of a pose thing that we did for our archives.
It's like y'all made a lot of long focus telescopes, high F ratios.
They're a lot easier to grind that way. And this was a prefabricated garage that my dad had built for us to kind of have our meetings in, and it was in our backyard. And remember this little 3.5-inch sky scope? Anybody ever see one of those? That was one of the first Newtonian reflectors that we had, and this was just some books and kind of the interior of the clubhouse, which was kind of very astronomical. It changed to many different things over the years, but that's what it was then. And again, just another picture. This is Tommy Hartzog, Phil Wright, Bob Ritter, and me. And this is some of the group that was out in my backyard. Over here is a real astronomer, Michael Snowden. Michael was in town here a few weeks ago, and I know he would love to have been here. Michael lives in New Zealand and is really a true astronomer. He's been spending quite a few years working on exoplanet photometry, and I had some interesting stories to tell me about those things. We had a younger group of people here, and I can't remember their names. This was Mike Wood, Phil Wright, Tommy Hartzog, I don't remember this fellow's name. And some of the other names escape me, but you'll give me that license if you will, please. And that was just the sky scope that we had, that 3.5-inch reflector that we used. That was a 6-inch. Obviously not an equatorial mount, but it worked pretty well. This was Ned Lawrence and Bob Ritter, and this was, I think was the sky scope that we had, or maybe it was another one. I think that was another telescope that someone had. And here we were digging the foundation for the 12-inch telescope, which I think you all have in your possession now. And this was the 12-inch telescope that we used. My dad built these steps for him, and also built a little sort of a enclosure that went over this, and we had a little motor drive, and so this was pretty fancy back then. We thought we could reach out and touch Uranus even. Now, this is interesting. Michael Snowden lived on Sweetbriar back when it was a 2-lane road, partially asphalt and partially gravel, and decided to build a little observatory out there because we thought we might be moving that direction. We needed an observatory, something that was enclosed and maybe not in our backyard, and they had quite a little acreage out there. So this was the beginning of the observatory that he finally built. We finally built one out there that actually had a little dome and everything, but this was the beginning of it on Sweetbriar. This is probably, I'm going to say 54, probably 55 maybe then.
Yeah, I think I've got 53 or 54 unknown on this. It's early days.
Early. And this is another picture that was in the paper. You saw the photograph earlier. That was in the paper, and I think this was one about the Perseid meteor shower.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And the Perseid meteor shower was really good. And again, this is another shot in that clubhouse. Before we actually started decorating, you see some of these models up there. One of my hobbies was model airplanes, so that was before we kind of moved it into the astronomy mode. Now this was probably, I've got some of the dates, this was 50, let me see.
54,
50,
February
it was 54, it was in February of 54. Several of us had been to some astronomical conventions in other cities. We went to Washington, D.C. and went to Atlanta and visited planetariums there. And when we returned to Memphis, we thought it'd be great if Memphis had a planetarium. So with the help of our fathers, who had a lot more pull than we did, we went and talked to some of the members of the Memphis City Council about the possibility of a planetarium, and they said, well, they didn't even know what a planetarium was. They said, well, we'll get you a demonstration. So we wrote the Spitz Laboratories, Elton, Maryland, and Herbert Williams, who was their only salesman, set up a time that worked out for everybody, and he brought this portable Spitz A1 projector down along with the canvas dome and put on a demonstration for the city council. And they were impressed enough that they allocated, I think, around 15 grand for all the equipment and the renovation to the room at the Pink Palace Museum. And this was where we actually held a demonstration in the basement of the Pink Palace Museum. This was the setup before they arrived. And allocate the money for this. And, I don't know what else you have coming up, but.
The article that you wrote for the paper.
Okay, well, this was actually talking about the demonstration and then, you know, the beginning of the planetarium after it was installed. And it was installed, I think, and opened in October of '54. And we operated the planetarium for about a year, year and a half, until Miss Bush, who was in charge of the museum, got a curator to come in part-time to do this. But we operated for about a year and a half. We just took turns. It held about 20 people, and it was successful. We always had a good turnout. Most of the shows are on the weekends, so that's kind of what that is. And this is over at the Pink Palace today, this is the projector that we used, and a little blurb about the Memphis Astronomical Society and so forth. And this is on display over there now. In '76, around '76, they installed a Minolta projector and built a new room along with an IMAX for the addition they put on the Pink Palace. And in December this year, they're going to remove that projector and they're going to get a digital projector. But this was the old A1. It worked well. I'll tell you a quick story that was kind of funny. Miss Bush was really, this was kind of her baby. It drew people in that normally wouldn't come to the museum. And the only problem it had is in the gear train right here, sometimes it would get a little bit noisy. So one afternoon, Michael Snowden and I went over there, and we had this thing all apart. We're going to grease this thing up and get it where and she walked in and saw all these parts, and she almost fell on the floor. And she said, "What have you done to my projector?" And I said, "Well, promise we know how to put it back together. It's going to work better than it did before." And she stood there and watched every bolt and nut go back together. We got her running again. Convinced her that it was better than it was. And
That's the history.
Yeah, that's the plaque that's right there with it.
okay,
That correctly credits you with getting it started.
well, I had a lot of help.
Yeah.
The history of it.
And this was a control panel. We had a little portable record player that we played the background music on. And we built a little 35mm slide projector because the ones that you could buy, there weren't that many back then that would fit our needs. And the focal length wasn't correct, so we built our own small little box type 35 that held one slide at a time, but it had a lens on there that was a wide angle, so it covered a big part of the dome, and we operated the voltage off, I can't remember which one of these, but we got voltage out of one of these little switches here. And it was like a 12-volt automotive bulb that we had behind the 35mm slide.
A couple little things to add in here. John is much too humble on his accounting of what went on there. In getting this set up, they had to talk to the Park Commission. Hal Lewis, those of you who are old enough remember, he was the director of the Park Commission then. And the school board bought into this. Ernest Ball was the superintendent of schools back then, and he was convinced, along with Mrs. Ruth Bush, that John already mentioned, and 35 civic leaders. And it's kind of hard to find 35 civic leaders in Memphis, either then or now. And this was before we had the city council form of government. It was just the commission, the mayor and the commission, so there weren't that many there that had to be convinced. I don't know if you all are familiar, well, I'll get it when I show you the projector a little closer. This was a 24-foot canvas dome, and I've got a close-up picture of that farther along too. They also talked to school principals and convinced them that that would be an excellent thing for when they were covering astronomy in school to come visit the planetarium and all of these motions and things hard to understand when you're reading about them in the book, just are a whole lot easier to see when you see them carried out on the dome over your head. And it was obvious from what I read back in these accounts that the city fathers did not know what a planetarium was, and that was true many years later when I was there. The director of the park commission came in and wanted me to open up the dome so they could see the heavens during the daytime. Apparently kind of mixed it up with an observatory or something like that. So that was an interesting little bit of history there that is kind of the same then as it was much later on. Armand Spitz was the one who made planetariums possible for small cities. Up until then, you had to buy an optical instrument where all of the stars were projected through lenses, and they would cost millions of dollars in today's money. And Spitz came up with an idea of just drilling holes in first a sphere and then a dodecahedron, each hole representing a star and the size of the hole representing its magnitude. And in this particular model, the brighter stars had little lenses over them to help focus the light so that the images wouldn't be huge discs on the dome. So the first magnitude stars got a little help from lenses. And we'll see a close-up of that in just a moment. According to these articles, you took some of these backers around to other cities again and showed them the planetarium and what they could do with it. I have the price figures on these. The projector itself cost $4,775, and the cloth dome, which kind of looked like a big parachute, 24 feet in diameter, cost $1,400. And then they had to fix up the room in the old Pink Palace to put it in there. And the main fixing up they did was to paint the windows black so that, because it was all windows all around the back, and you certainly wouldn't want that behind the dome. Unfortunately, over the years, the black paint kept flaking off, and we had little extra things like Magellanic clouds all over the dome, but it needed painting again. Look at this up close. You can see the lenses that are soldered on there for the first magnitude stars. And you can have to get a little bit of astronomy into this tonight, because this is the Astronomical Society. Notice that all of the first magnitude stars are in kind of a belt around the sky, Gould's belt, and following the plane of the Milky Way. So there's the lesson. And the planets were fastened to this disk, which you can see is inclined 23.5 degrees to the axis of the Earth, which is the axis of the star projector as it turned. Polaris would be right in the center there, and this is Capella, the farthest north first magnitude star. So don't say we didn't have any astronomy at all in this meeting. Next time you all are over at the planetarium, be sure you read this, because it's got a good little history there of how it all got started. Okay, moving up to, let me just mention that this was used, this planetarium that John arranged for, was used for 23 years, which is almost unheard of, until we got the Minolta projector and the whole new planetarium in 1977. In 1956, we have a record that shows December 31st, we had a bank statement showing we had $57.46 in the bank, and we had just gotten our tax-exempt status. And so you could make donations to the Astronomical Society and get a tax credit for it. In 1957, that was when I started coming around. There's a misconception that I was one of the founders of the Astronomical Society. As you can see, everything that took place up to this point did not involve me at all. The way I got involved was through the Astronomical Society, actually. On March 3rd, 1957, a fellow down the street from us on Reese, who went to school at St. Anne's with my brother Tom, he was in the Boy Scouts, a troop at St. Anne's. And one of the members of the Memphis Astronomical Society, George Turner, who lived over on Wilshire, not too far from where Diane lives, Scouts. It was a handheld cardboard tube with little brass rings on each end and terrible lenses throughout, and it was advertised for something like 600 power, and it may have, but it wasn't a very good telescope. But he came up to our house one night and showed us a few things through it. The moon was up, and that looked amazing. And then he started pointing out constellations, and I went in the house and got a little notebook that was my first logbook, and wrote down on that day that we had observed Orion, the Big Dipper, and Leo. And that was my first astronomical record keeping. And I've recorded every observing session since then, and sometimes that's come in handy. During that summer, I went to the meetings of the Astronomical Society over in the basement of the Pink Palace. Mike Snowden was president then. We saw pictures of him a little while ago. There were up to 35 members in the summer of 1957. Mostly kids who could walk to the meeting place from the neighborhood, or if they lived too far away, then the parents were there because they had to provide the transportation. None of them were old enough to drive at that point, or very few were. I wanted to join that summer, but there were two problems. One, I didn't have a telescope, and that was a requirement there. And secondly, I was too young, which was, I think, the last time I've been too young for anything. Typical program during that summer, I saved one of the programs. They printed them up on ditto purple stuff and handed them out, and I've still got one of them. And then certain problems of planetary flight. And if that... Okay, let's resume.
Right, sit down and get started.
Is it a lion?
We're still in 1959
It is a
here
lion.
at 558 Sweetbriar Road, which, as John pointed out, is not that far from Poplar, and it's some big, huge gated community thing there now, but that was where the Snowdens lived, including Mike Snowden, who was the president at that point. They decided to upgrade that Sweetbriar Observatory that you saw a picture of a little bit earlier, and they cast a 9x9 concrete slab and sunk a 5-inch pipe down into the concrete to mount a telescope on. They were shooting for a 10-inch telescope with automatic tracking and guiding. They, kind of interesting, they pretty much had built the observatory first before they had a telescope really lined up to go into it. This dome that was on here was part of a silo, and it had an upper and lower shutters. And that lower shutter, as you can see, that's lowered down by ropes, is just the right height to run into in the dark. I think a piece of sheet metal hanging there in head height, I think I still have some divots missing out of my head from running into that thing in the dark.
Was that more dangerous than the lion?
Ultimately, yes. Potentially, no. But what I was afraid of was that shutter would draw blood, and then that would draw the line. This is Mike Snowden, and this is Billy Gooch, who was one of our members then. And he was a machinist, an expert professional machinist, and he could make just about anything. And the lion is Dandelion. This article here is from Sky Telescope in May 1960. They wrote up the whole observatory, and if you care to check it out, whether you have the DVD backlogs or whether you have the actual hard copies, as I do, you can check this out. And in May 1960, we had a several-page feature article in Sky Telescope about our observatory. anticipation of it opening, they wrote up a bunch of observatory rules, and man, they were strict. You had to do this and not do that, and it was a pretty hard and fast set of rules that they expected you to go by. They also had a logbook set up in which you had to record everything that you saw, what eyepiece you used, what magnification, what objects, of course, and seeing conditions. All of that had to go into the logbook. And before you were allowed to use the telescope, you had to take a test to demonstrate that you knew everything that had to be done in order to operate it correctly. I should point out that Mr. Flippin, the president then, or no, he wasn't the president right then, but he was soon after, was totally against this project because it was way too far out. It was out there on Sweetbriar Road, and it was out in the country, and nobody would ever go out there. So he was against it, but he came around after a while. The lion, Dandelion, just getting ahead of myself a little bit, would visit the observing sometime after we had it set up with the telescope in it. She would come in to the observing in the dark, pitch black dark out there, and you'd feel it rubbing around on your legs. And, you know, lions purr, and when she'd get happy, I don't know, from anticipation of a meal or something, I'm not sure what, but she would get in there and start purring. And inside that dome with all the reflective surfaces, it kind of sounded like a helicopter coming through there. And then we knew the lion, Dandelion, was present. Sometime during that summer in '59, I got a call from Mike Snowden. I'd just been on the board since March, and he wanted me to go with him up to Vanderbilt. He was going to school there then, but he was off for the summer, and he was studying astronomy. And as John pointed out, he's one of the few of us that ever did become a real professional astronomer. And he wanted me to go with him and a couple of others up to Vanderbilt to check out a telescope that one of the professors had arranged to give to us if we wanted it. I considered that an honor at the time, but I think it was mainly because I was a student and off for the summer, but I was too young to get a summer job, so I was available. So that was how I was included in the group. Well, we got up to Vanderbilt, and it turns out that the professor that had the telescope was Carl Seifert. And we were waiting for him in his office there. He was actually in, but he was talking to somebody, and I saw the sign on his door. And when he came in, I said, "It's nice to meet you, Dr. Seifert." And he said, "That would be Seifert." And so, but he was nice. I was expecting some old geezer like Einstein or something. You know, you think of the astronomy professor, but he was about 48 at the time, and a nice-looking guy, kind of like a movie actor. I don't know, Jimmy Stewart or something. I don't know, but he certainly wasn't what I was expecting to see. You know, I got his name wrong on top of that. But he took us out into the back there, and there was this old telescope, and our hearts just sank. It was the tube was made of sheet metal wrapped around and soldered or welded or something, and the bottom 2 feet of it, where the mirror was all totally rusted out. So we wound up taking the mirror out of it, and there wasn't any finder, and the mount was junk, so we wound up bringing the mirror home and built the telescope around it. So, and unfortunately, Dr. Seifert was killed in a car accident the next a couple of years later, in summer of 1961, at the age of 49, he passed away from injuries in a car accident. This was the telescope itself. This is from the May 1960 Sky and Telescope again. It had an open framework tube, which was fine because it was pitch black dark out there. The mirror is down here at the bottom, and the tubes are all separate pieces of, these are aluminum rods, and the last segment up at the top was stainless steel. And the whole diagonal and eyepiece mechanism rode on the, and the spotter all rode on these, you can see the arrangement over here where they slide up and down. You can change the focal length of the telescope by sliding it around, like if you put a camera on and that would have a different focal plane, you can compensate for that by sliding it around. And then you can also see the counterweights that could be slid around to balance almost anything you put on there. So it was quite a telescope. You can't see it very well in this picture, but these are the setting circles for the right ascension and declination. But there was a drive mechanism that Billy Gooch made that was hydraulic. There was a wire wrapped around a 12-inch wheel on the end of the polar axis, and it went down, straight down into the floor, into a pulley, and across a conduit under the floor and up the wall on the side, where there was a cylinder full of oil and a piston that would float down through it and pull the wire, turn the telescope to track objects. And you control the speed by adjusting little needle valves in the mechanism where the piston would lower through the cylinder. It was kind of a mess. It was very steady and smooth, no jerking, no gears or anything. The whole gearless system, but it was a pain in the neck to use. Okay, going into 1960, keeping track of the presidents here, just to put things into context. November 1960, Kennedy was elected president, and we had a talk on planetary life, extraterrestrial life. It was held at East High School. To show you the publicity, the meeting was December 1st. We had a week and a day ahead, the Thursday ahead of that, we had an article talking about the program and who all was coming. There were 3 people from Huntsville who were going to come up and talk about the search for life on other worlds. And all of it just says December, which is kind of vague. Up here it actually said December 1st. So typos are not brand new in the paper. So that was a week ahead. The day of, in the commercial appeal, the morning paper, we had essentially all of that information again, just to remind everybody to come. And for Goldsmiths. And the afternoon paper, the Press Senator, also had a blurb in it that afternoon of the evening of the proposed talk. And this was the program itself. Mr. Flippin introduced them, and then we had the 3 different talks by the 3 different people. Unfortunately, Mr. Wells didn't make it. So the others tried to fill in for him, and it was kind of strange. And that was the main one I was interested in myself, was how you actually searched for life on other planets. But these others were kind of vague and weird. They mainly talked about porpoises and things like that. So I was kind of disappointed, but we had a huge turnout. 173 people attended that meeting. And like I said, it was at East High School in 1961. And I didn't see Sybil Shepherd there. She was a student there at the time, but she didn't come to the meeting, I don't believe. We used to be the same age. Had I gone to East High instead of Christian Brothers High School, we would have been classmates. But I see now that her publicity statement shows that she's 3 years younger than me now. I assume she's been traveling at or near the speed of light sometime during that interval. Then, the next day, we had 2 follow-up articles. This was in the morning paper. Here's Mr. Flippin, John Flippin, the president again. Here's George Turner. Remember that name? He was the one that introduced our neighbor to astronomy and indirectly me. And Ronald Ferdy and Green from Huntsville. And this is Mark Folis Jr. Mark Folis was the secretary of the Astronomical Society at the time, and he was an architect who designed a lot of buildings around town, and this was his son. Mark Sr. has since passed away. His wife is still living, and Mark himself ran for the city council and did not win a couple of years ago. I saw him at a wedding about a year ago, so he's still around, Mark Jr. Then the evening paper followed up on it as well. So we had a week ahead, 2 the day of, and 2 the day after for our one meeting. And that was the publicity we got for that. And again, it's all about dolphins. The reporter was there, and that was mainly what they talked about, so that's, that was an accurate representation of what we got. In 1962, I had to give my first talk in January 5th, actually. Mr. Flipman called me up and said, Bill, you've been a member for over 4 years now, and you haven't given a talk yet. And I could see what was coming, and my guts just went cold, because I didn't talk in front of groups. If I had to give a 1-minute talk at school, I was just paralyzed with fear. And I told him I just could not get up in front of a group and talk. And he said, well, you got to get over that if you're going to ever do anything important. And besides, I've already got you on the program, and it's printed up.
Wait, I'm gonna take that note down for
that's my way to do it.
reference.
Yeah, so I was about the second of 6 talks on the program, and my topic was how to set up and use a reflector telescope. He knew I knew how to do that since I'd had the telescope for months and was taking it to observing sessions. He said, all you got to do is just tell them what you do. I said, well, how do I start? What do I do? He said, you figure up a nice opening sentence and memorize it so you don't have to think while you're up there at first. And you curl your toes into your shoes to hold you steady. And just keep remembering, if you make it through the first minute, you're going to live. So that's what I did. And unfortunately, he didn't seem to know the incantation to stop the talking, but that was how I got started. Later on that year, in September, I had a baptism by fire of my first program that I presented to the scout group. George Turner, one I was telling you about, that got me interested, had arranged to give an astronomy program to a Boy Scout troop at Evergreen Presbyterian Church, you know, where that is over on University, right across from Southwestern or Rhodes College. And he called me up and wanted me to go with him to just be his assistant. So you don't have to do anything but just hand out star maps and show them the moon through your telescope. And I figured, well, I could do that. The morning of the meeting that night, this was in the commercial appeal. Remark by child brings charges against accountant. Well, it turns out that George Turner had been taking pictures of partially clad girls in the neighborhood for a long time and had a whole collection of obscene stuff at his house and got carted off to jail. And it was in the paper that morning. My father said, don't you know him? I said, yeah, I'm going with him tonight to a meeting. I think so. And my mother said, I never did like him. And my younger brother said, he blew a booger on me once at the meeting, sitting behind him. So they were all down on him immediately. And so I didn't have any idea what to do. I didn't even drive then. I was 18, but I'd been so busy in high school, I didn't ever get my license till then. So I couldn't even go. So father said, why don't you call somebody else? So I called Bill Gaskill, who was the treasurer after Mark Fullis. And he was an architect also. He was the one that was in on designing the stadium, and we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. That he agreed to take me on the condition that he didn't have to do anything but drive me there, and he would be my assistant. And I said, well, what am I going to do? I have no idea what I'm going to do. He said, well, you think of something? He was always cheerful and never let anything get in his way, especially if it was somebody else's problem. So he picked me up, took me there, and we went through the program. I have no idea what I said or did, but I think they liked it because they kept asking questions, and we finally had to tell them it's time to go. It was not a Friday, it was a school night, so I had to get back home. And I guess the kids did too. So that was the first presentation I ever gave to a group. And again, that's continued ever since. I would have liked to have eased into it a little differently, but that's the way it was. 1964 is when the Beatles came to the United States, and LBJ came to the White House, escalated the Vietnam War, and we got an eclipse of the moon. In June of 1964, we had this article in the Commercial Appeal. big thing about, it was a good time for it. It was like 7 in the evening till 9 at night, and it was just an ideal time for a public observing session, which we scheduled for the front lawn of the Pink Palace Museum. And they wrote up a nice article that was about 80% correct. And then the press senator came out and took a picture and had several things. I hated that term stargazers even then. And they got our ages right, but only one of us was the son of Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Busler, and ready their telescope. It was not their telescope, it was my telescope. And it was not on the Memphis Museum grounds. We were in my side yard at the time they took the picture. So they faked all of that. They were lying here, so you can keep getting awakenings as you go. But we had a huge number of people that turned up for that, and got several members out of it, which was fortunate because we were down to very few members. In fact, by the end of the year, we were down to 10 members. And Tim, the job you had to do with rounding up 10 people to run out of 50, you can imagine what it is when you only got 10. Everybody in the Astronomical Society had to be on the board, and we really only had 9 into the election. So our first item of business in January was we brought Lawson Kidd. Some of us remember Lawson. He had a membership application. We told him to come to the board meeting and we would vote on him. And he said, well, what if you vote me down? We're not going to do that. So he came to the board meeting. We voted him in and made him secretary on the spot. And now we have a board with 10 members on it. So it can be worse than what you just had to go through.
That's why he did that to me.
Yeah. Okay, in 1965, things kind of turned around. We got a new president, Walter Hurd, and one of the first things that happened right after that was he and I got together, and he thought it'd be a good idea if we had a constitution, which we later changed to bylaws. So I drafted that up, and we talked about it for about 4 board meetings, and finally got it in almost its final form. It keeps evolving over the years as things change, but that was how that got started in early 1965. And before long, by that summer, our membership had gotten from 10 up to 50 members. And here was a picture of us. I don't know how they got us all to look so ghoulish in that picture. I think they had a giant flash bulb hanging over our heads. But we started a series of articles. Walker had arranged with the paper that he and I would take turns or collaborate writing a series of articles, and it went on for 2 years. We had a month, it happened every month, once a month, on the Sunday morning paper. And at this point, here is Walter Hurd, and there is Walter Hurd. If he will come up here.
I never looked like that, though.
Walker, come on up, please. Okay, Walker was the president of the Astronomical Society back during the 60s when we did a whole lot of our most important things. And if you want to share any reminiscences, that would be
I
great.
tell you what, I'll let you fill in the details, but I will tell them about my telescope I built.
Yes.
When I moved to LA after I graduated from Memphis State, and went to Griffith Observatory. I was working as a computer programmer, systems analyst. I went up to Griffith Observatory and started grinding me a mirror. They had a lab up there, you could go up and work on it and all that. And then my wife and I had to bring our oldest 2 kids, we didn't have 2 then, we had to come back to Memphis. And I brought it back, and A.C. Emory, I had met Bill when he was 15. And that was my only exposure to the Astronomical Society before that. And I don't know how I got in touch with him or what. We went to the Astronomical Society meetings and all that. Anyway, A.C. Emory was on the board of directors he worked at Southwestern, and he let me use their physics lab to finish grinding my mirror and polishing it and all that. And he helped me out with some. And when I first got it, was that my telescope?
I guess.
It looks about like it.
Yeah, that's it. The water heater.
Shoot, I don't know how to use one of these. Anyway, finished grinding the mirror, polishing it and all that, and I ordered some things, I think through Memphis Scientific catalog, and I got an 8-inch mirror, and that's a 9.5-inch diameter tube, and it's almost 6 foot long. And the base that I bought was a cast iron, straight down, had 3 legs sticking out from it. Cast iron weighed about 50 pounds. The equatorial mount on it weighed about 85 pounds. It was cast iron. And we got it out first time, and we split the double-double in Epsilon there, and Bill said, I don't believe it. I didn't either, but it was a beautiful sight. But I will say just one little thing. 1963, after I got back from LA, I bought a 1963 Volkswagen, red Volkswagen with a sunroof. And one night we were going out to Collierville, where you could actually see the sky then. You know, it was beautiful out there. I've forgotten who had the property out there, Pleasant Ridge Road or something?
Oh, Foster Ridge.
Okay. Anyway, we went out there that night, and Mr. Flippin, when we got ready to come back, he says, I've seen 2 miracles tonight. Milky Way like I've never seen it before in my life, and you getting that 8-inch telescope in that Volkswagen. The tube was sticking out the top, and the legs were sticking all over the place, and it was about to weigh the tires down too. Anyway, Bill can fill you in on all of the other stuff. He remembers it a lot better than I do. Anyway, it was we had all the meetings at my house once a month and all that for a long time. The guy right there on the right was a disc jockey at WNPS. He was the program director, Hal Smith. And we lived across the street from each other, so I got him into it. And anyway, the night that they landed on the moon in 1969, I took my kids down there when Kennedy said, we're going to go to the moon before the end of the decade. And I said, when we go, I'm going to be down there. Of course, they postponed a lot of them, aborted them. But luckily, when I went down there, they were there. I took 2 of my kids, my sister, and what have you, and came back. It took them 3 days to get there. Came back, and Howell called me up and said, you want to be on the radio with me tonight and watch the moon landing? I said, nobody's going to be listening to us. He said, I got to be on the radio. You come and help me talk to them. So we were watching black and white TV as they landed on the moon, and we were talking about it on the radio. I said, nobody's listening to us, but anyway, it was quite an experience. This brings back some good memories. Bill was the scientific guy. I was one of the layman president type, but we got a lot done though. And I'll let Bill fill in all the details and the rest of it.
There's one detail about your telescope, and that is the tube, you bought it plenty long so as to make sure it wasn't too short. And but you never got up the nerve to cut it. You left it the whole length, the whole time, and the diagonal was back about here. Well, you can see where the eyepiece is back there. So the tube was way longer than it needed to be, which made it even more miraculous that it fit into the Volkswagen. And then I remember later on you bought a station wagon and it wouldn't fit.
We got it in the Volkswagen easier than I did the station wagon.
Yeah. That was a wonderful telescope. And
Question.
yeah.
Here it's got Memphis Astronomical Association.
Yes, that's a mistake. We didn't change our name.
Okay.
That's a commercial appeal-ism. Another picture that was in another time, instead of calling it a telescope, they called it a lens mirror. They just, for some reason, just listed the components or something instead of calling it a telescope. So it was always interesting to read the paper and see what they actually did with what you gave them. Sometimes you wondered if you had a stroke while you're talking to them or something.
Tim, you should have seen what happened when they put Memphis Astronomical Society in.
I wasn't going to mention that. One time when we ran the short course once, we said we're going to have a short course in astrology. And that was when we were over at the Pink Palace. We had hundreds of people there that were lined up around the room, out in the hall, sitting on the steps, everything. And they all stayed politely through the first half of the meeting, but we never saw most of them again.
That was the biggest mailing list we ever had.
Sunday every month for 2 years, we had this column in the Sunday morning paper. They decided to help by redoing the sky map. They left all the stars there that I had, but they put all the constellation names in right side up if you were facing north. So they changed that around and didn't leave it the way we had it. We did a lot of interesting things there. Let's see, the next picture I've got here is from 1966, right after I graduated from college. In the spring of '66 was when we came up with our new logo that we still use today. I was supposed to be studying for an exam over in the school library at CBC, but I hated studying. I never did like school, and my mind was wandering. I started doodling and scribbling as to what a good emblem might be for the Astronomical Society. I said, it ought to show something about astronomy, so we need a star image, but it also ought to have something to do with physics, so I put in a couple of little orbitals there and sketched out 2 or 3 versions of it, and I got where I liked it. And that afternoon, after school, I went down to the Art Center on Union Avenue and bought some ellipse guides and some rub-on letters and came up with the logo and took it to the printer, and we had our letterhead that I still have that original artwork at home, by the way. Also, that year, started writing articles for Sky and Telescope. So if you look back in '66, Sky and Telescope, you'll see a series of articles on Messier objects, which in a couple of years didn't hurt at all for us to, when we came out with the book, but that's in a moment. Here are 2 of our members, Bonnie and Carol Whiteleather. They were twins, but not identical, and they were both daughters of Dr. John Whiteleather, who was the chief of radiology at Baptist Hospital. And we had this particular publicity. Louise Ahrens wrote it up. It didn't hurt that she was my aunt, so I could feed her stuff there. And mentioned the Planetarium show that Bob Ritter was giving at the Planetarium, and the Whiteleathers. And most of this is wondering, just for those of you who are female type persons and think it's always been the way it is now, it hasn't been. This was 1966, and most of this article deals with how remarkable it is that they fly airplanes and they do radio nuclear technician jobs, and they're girls. And that was the main thrust of this article. They even called the airplane thing the powder puff derby that they were in. And they mentioned here that Walker is the president, data processing instructor. He was a little modest about his background there. He was sort of the founder of the computer program department at what used to be State Tech. It was over on Poplar a while and then moved out to the new place out east on the expressway, and he was the founder of that and was there for many, many years. Okay, in July of that year, another article. This one was in QST. We were just talking at the break about how many people were in astronomy and also ham radio at the same time. Well, another one of our members was Paul Wilson, who is up here on this platform. He lived at Collierville at 226 Peterson Lake Road, and his house in the side yard had this enormous tower with a radio dish on it, and every day he would observe the sun with it. Rain or shine, you can see right through the clouds what he was doing. It was an 18-foot parabolic reflector, and he observed it every day. He was an engineer at WMC Television, and he was the one who invented and developed the moon bounce program. You might have heard of that, where you can send radio signals and bounce them off the moon and then pick them up again 2.5 seconds or so later. And they picked him up in South America, and he was doing that all over the world. And then he expanded that to doing bounces off the Perseid meteor trails. The ion trails are reflected. So if you had enough meteors going by at a given length of time, and the trails persisted a little while, he could bounce a signal off of those ion trails and pick those back up on the Earth again. And so he did those techniques as well. And it's got written up in QST, which is the magazine equivalent of Sky and Telescope for ham radio people. The American Radio Relay League was the organization. And they still publish QST. I've got a whole bunch of them up in my attic. If you ever want any of the old ones that go back to the 40s and 50s and so on. That summer also, we decided to start another observatory. The one on Sweetbriar, Mike Snowden had gone away and we didn't have access to that anymore. We took the telescope out of it because it belonged to the Astronomical Society. And we started an observatory out at Collierville on Paul Wilson's property. He had a farm, besides his house in town, he had a farm just outside, and he let us build the telescope, the observatory out there. He was part of the repeater program. For military purposes, they would have amateur radio operators would agree to take in signals, send them back out in wartime to sort of propagate signals all around if anything came up. This was in the days of air raid sirens and air raid shelters and everything, so they had to be ready for whatever happened. And he had that property out there, and he let us store the telescope in it and then set it up on his property. We started right away calling this Mount Wilson Observatory after Paul Wilson. And we had a slab and pipe there, already done that year. Long about this time, we started trying to make our mark in town. Walker was, as you probably figured out, a very dynamic president, and he was always thinking of things that we could do to attract people and get them interested in astronomy and join up with us. So during 1966, three of us got together. Mark Follis, who was an architect, Bill Gaskell, who was the architect that took me to the scout meeting that fateful night, and I got together and we decided Memphis needed an astronomy center. So we're kind of modeling this a little bit after our logo, but they couldn't think of four things to go on there, so we have a 3-point star here. A new big planetarium, 50-foot planetarium with a multi-million-dollar projector, an auditorium, and an observatory. And then monoliths like Stonehenge all around. And this was a sort of perspective view of it. The city was very much in favor of it. We got some teachers together, and the city officials, kind of like John did back many years before, and it was approved by the superintendent, E.C. Stenberg at the time, and a bunch of city officials, and they signed off on it on May 28th that it was approved. And they sent it off to get federal funding with a big write-up, a grant proposal. And I forget how that turned out. Needless to say, we didn't get it. I don't know if they rejected it or ignored it or just what happened. But Walker, do you happen to remember?
Well, Taylor was kind of against it because they had one at Southwestern. And he was one of the ones they were talking to and all that. And anyway, there were things like that, so it just never developed. We
Well,
did
it sure
get the Board of
didn't.
Education because that seemed to be the best approach. We didn't quite get it done.
Yeah, this was one that kind of fell through. They even had land for it. This is Perkins, south of Southern, and this is either where the Little Theater is now, or if that's over there, then this is the extreme east of Audubon Park. But they had both sites there that we could have had we gotten the money for it. So that was one of our non-successes that time. In October, Saturn was edge on, ringless, and although that's a very uninteresting time to see it, we made the most of it and told the paper about it. And we one night we coupled it with a lunar eclipse and the Perseid meteors starting up on August 11th. And we had 500 people show up over at the front lawn of the Pink Palace to look at Saturn without its rings and the moon disappearing. And we didn't really see any meteors there right in town. But we got several members out of that, and that was a very interesting experience. I think that's the most we've ever had at a public observing session. Also, back in 1967, coming up, I was up at Duquesne University working on my doctorate in physical chemistry before I decided to switch to biochemistry and come back to Memphis. I was up there, and during the final exam week in May of 1967, I got a telegram from Paul Wilson. A little Western Union guy with a hat came up to my dorm room, knocked on the door, and handed me this telegram. They did that back then. And it said something like, advise, look for Aurora tonight, stop, regards, Paul, stop. So I'd never seen an Aurora before, but what it turned out was, I called him that afternoon, and it was for 2 days later, actually. He sent it to me, but that noon he had discovered a huge flare on the sun that was right in the middle, and it was heading our way. And he figured there would be all kinds of auroral activity, and he was sure right. 2 days later was the night before our really advanced organic chemistry final exam. So I had to make a choice to sit out in front of the dorm and watch the aurora all night, or study for the organic chemistry exam. Well, guess what I did? I watched the aurora all night. I had no idea what I got on the exam, but I got a C for the course. So, and my only C in graduate schools, that must have really been awful. That's like an F in graduate school. But I was already packed to leave town the next day, so to come back to Memphis. So I kind of wrote that off and watched the aurora all night. But he made the prediction, sent it by telegram, and I saw it from Pittsburgh. It was gorgeous, beautiful curtains weaving around, just the whole works. Also, Walker mentioned Hal Smith, who was a DJ, but also a program director for WMPS, 680. It was the top 40 format back then. And he and Walker and I were invited to make a series of programs, 5 minutes long, read from a script and were pre-recorded. And we did 13 of them all together. And they were about astronomy, one little topic that could be read in 5 minutes. And they were broadcast at 9:30 Sunday morning, or at least I'm told that they were. So we got some inquiries about that. Some people were listening then, and we got some people that came around as a result of that. In July '67, I had come back from Pittsburgh, from Duquesne, and was getting ready to start at UT, but not yet. So I had that whole summer off. And I went swimming a lot at Walker's neighborhood swimming pool. He'd pick me up every day and we'd go swimming. And but most of the time I was finishing writing the first Messier guidebook, the Amateur Guide to the Messier Objects, which turned out to be later on Volume 1. It was a group effort, actually. I would write up directions and run them off on a purple ditto, give them out to members at the meeting and ask them to try them out, see how this works. And sometimes people say, this is great, it saved me a lot of time. Other times, I can't even find the stars in the field, you're going to have to do something better. So it went through many iterations until we got through with it. We finally did finish it up later on that year and got it printed. Pat Astor was one of our another ham radio members who had access to a printing press at his church. And we printed the whole thing there at night after he got off. He got off at midnight and we worked till 2 or 3 in the morning printing at his church and got them all printed and bound up. And we sold them for $1 a piece back then. That same summer, the Meteorite got started, our newsletter. Up until then, we just sent out a meeting notice, whatever, not to the little sheet with the program on it, and that was all we would send out. Well, Jerry Walker was a treasurer then, but also he was the newsletter editor. It wasn't really a newsletter, just sent that out. He said, I want to expand this into something more. So he wrote up several pages of stuff, typed it up on the Ditto Master, and said, we're going to have a newsletter. And he called me up one Sunday afternoon and said, it's all ready to go, it's all typed up, but what are we going to call it? Do you have any ideas? And I didn't have any ideas, so I just made up something crazy and stupid and said, you know, the Beatles had just said Beatles with an A. So I said Meteorite with a W. and he thought that was just wonderful and crazy. And I could hear him typing. He was typing on the Ditto Master in the background there. And I said, I was just kidding. I didn't mean it. And he said, well, it's too late now. It's already on the Master, and we're going to run it off this afternoon. So that was volume 1, number 1 of the meteorite that came out in July 1967. And we've had one almost every month since then. So that's how that got started, in case you were wondering. We also finished building the walls of the observatory. We did this in stages. We never rushed through anything. So we had the slab and the pedestal the year before. This year we got the walls. It was a couple more years before we finally got the roof on it, but we're a little bit at a time. And in the fall, Walker made arrangements to teach an adult education course at Memphis State, as it was called back then. And he got me to kind of help out on some of the lectures. We wound up kind of team teaching it or something. He was officially the teacher, but I was there some of the time. And it went on that whole fall evening semester. I don't know how many weeks it was. Do you remember how long that went on?
I don't remember, Bill. We did it several times, I know.
Yeah, but the first time we did it, we got 3 members out of it. Ben Hudgens, Orrin Miller, and Dr. Bill Metzger. We figured this was worth doing, so we did it several more times and didn't get anybody, I don't think. But that was kind of interesting that we cast the net out like that and got some back. Okay, 1968, we got Nixon, and I started writing articles for the Review of Popular Astronomy of articles that are Messier objects that were not in the first book. People kept writing to me and saying, well, what about the other 60? The first book just had 50. And I'd write back and say that, well, now once you learn how to do it that way, you ought to be able to find your own. And they said, well, no, I'd rather just have something to go by. And after a while, I agreed with them because I was going by little notes and things I'd write up in the house on how to find things, so I didn't have to figure it out in the field. So I started writing a series of articles for the Review of Popular Astronomy and kept that going until they went out of business. I don't know if that put them under or what. At that time, we printed another 500 copies of the book because we had sold out, and we got enough money to pay for the observatory just from selling the books at $1 a piece, postage paid, and yeah, that was interesting that we got that much. 1969, Mr. Flippin became president again after Walker for another 5 years. And about that time, another disaster hit us. People started telling Mr. Flippin that they weren't getting their sky and telescope. So he told me about it, and I called my friend Bill Shawcross at Sky and Telescope, who was the managing editor then, and he said, you haven't sent in any money since last fall. And that's why they're not getting the Sky and Telescope. So only a few people were, and they turned out to be ones that had joined recently and kind of paid ahead. They were ahead on their subscription, but all the regular members were not getting it. So Mr. Flippin called the bank and said, you better come out here. So he went out there, and they told him our balance was $6.53. And it was supposed to have been like $700 with all the money from the book and everything in there. It was all gone. It turns out that our treasurer had a bad drug habit. The first one I'd ever heard of, that you had to buy drugs with other people's money, and that's what he did. So we voted him out of office for the only time that's ever been done in the Astronomical Society, vote somebody out. And we had him sign a promissory note, and we got $50 of it back, and then he disappeared and went to San Francisco. So that was one of the bad things. In July, of course, it's already been mentioned, that's when we had the first moon landing in 1969. In 1970, we mounted a big expedition and went to Perry, Florida. There were a bunch of us that went down there for a total solar eclipse. It was 76% in Memphis, but it was 100% Valdosta, Georgia, Perry, Florida, on up through the east coast to Maine. So half a dozen of us went down there. Well, it turns out that our reservations got screwed up, and at first we had duplicate rooms, then we wound up with not enough rooms, and we all had to stay in one room. So I got to spend the night in a motel bed with a lovely young lady who was a reporter from the Commercial Appeal. I told her there was nothing to worry about. I was Memphis' oldest virgin bachelor. And when it was all said and done, I still was. So that was that. The eclipse was clouded out. We got up that morning, totally overcast. And everybody said, don't worry, it's always like that here. We always have fog and clouds in the morning. Well, sure enough, about 10 o'clock, the clouds separated, cleared off, revealing a layer, an impenetrable layer of higher clouds that never did go away all day. Everybody there seemed to think it had been called off, and they were genuinely concerned when it got pitch black dark for about 5 minutes there. It went ahead as scheduled, we just couldn't see anything, but it really did get dark right there in the middle of the day. So that's why when people ask me if I've ever seen an eclipse, I say, well, sort of. So just saw part of it, not all of it. In 1971, we had the National Astronomical League Convention here in Memphis. We had it over at Rhodes. Dr. Taylor took care of all of the arrangements for everything. It was just wonderful. At that time, we had 67 members, and I was the general chairman of the convention, and I had something for practically everybody to do, whether it's picking up people at the airport or handing out stuff or fetching food or whatever. It was definitely a big group effort. Everybody seemed to think it was the best program that they'd ever had because I screwed up. I went and invited everybody who wrote for Sky and Telescope to come, and they all accepted. I figured I would get like one or two of them. But we had Robert Cox of the amateur mirror grinding fame, Walter Scott Houston, Deep Sky Objects, Walter Haas of the AAVSO, John Strong, a physicist who was Dr. Taylor's mentor, David Dunham with the occultations, and several others, Ernest Royning, University of Georgia. Everybody I wrote to accepted, and I figured, well, okay, we'll just have a kind of a long program, and everybody thought it was really good, but we kept everybody busy in that particular group project. Okay, we didn't make it with the observatory and the planetarium complex, but we did make our mark in a few ways. This is now known as Liberty Bowl Stadium. It used to be Memphis Memorial Stadium. What does that have to do with the Memphis Astronomical Society? Well, the architect was Bill Gaskell. I remember, once again, who bailed me out on the George Turner night, and he was the architect for it. One afternoon, he called me up and said, we want to fix this stadium up so that the home team is never looking into the sun during football games. And how do we go about doing that? I said, well, do you want me to fix it where? Give you an angle where it can slant, so, it's going to be crooked. He said, that's fine, that's all right. And just figure it out. He gave me the dates of the football season. So I calculated where the sun would be, and so they built it with this slant. This is Hollywood Street, running north and south right there. And this was the home team side. It used to have the press box, it still does, and this other side was lower. Now they built the big press box over on this side, but originally it was only about this high on that side, and that was the visitors. So they'd be looking straight across the home side into the sun for all the afternoon football games there. So if you ever get stuck on that side looking into the sun, you can blame me for that. Okay, 1972, in July, I finally became the planetarium director myself. And here's that little pointer that we were looking at earlier, where it plugs into the board there. It's still there in the display. And the dome, you can see here, the lights on it kind of orange, and these little stripes of the ribs that held it up, they kind of look like a giant pumpkin in there. But a lot of people got their astronomy first education there in that little planetarium from, this was right near the end, because I was the last director of that planetarium, because eventually we got this one put in. This was the one with the new Minolta and the 50-foot dome. And they changed up things quite a bit from there since then, but this was the way it was when it was newly my baby. Okay, last picture here. This was what happened 20 years ago. We had a 40th anniversary celebration, and we got a big write-up in the Commercial Appeal with that. John Buhler, who wrote a very nice article, and kind of, I wish I had time for you to read that or me read it to you, but it was just a very nice article and talking about all the things that had happened since then, and went on for another page too. And so, as we conclude, you know, this is 20 years ago, now it's now, we kind of have to wonder who all's going to still be around in another 10 or 20 years. Any of us? Will the Astronomical Society still exist? Will astronomy still exist? Or will we all be swinging through the trees and not any education for anybody or what? You never know. But I can tell you this, that if we do persevere and education perseveres and astronomy continues to exist, it will be because of you all, especially the younger ones and people like you and the ones that come along behind you. And we hope that somebody will put on a program like this maybe 10 years from now. Okay, that's about it. Thank you.
Bill?
Yeah.
This is something you might want to read to the group. It's a copy, but I can get the original. Mike Snowden gave me this,
Okay.
and you might want to read that if you can.
It says, good luck to the Memphis Astronomical Society from Arthur C. Clarke via Bob Allred, 26 April 1956.
Bob was in San Diego visiting some of his relatives in downtown and looked across the street and saw someone that he thought he looked like Arthur C. Clarke, and went over and introduced himself and told him that he was a member of the Memphis Astronomical Society, and so he wrote that note. And,
Yes.
and Michael Snowden had that and sent that to me a few months ago. So anyway, if you want the copy, you
Okay.
can have it, and I'll see if I
All
can
right.
get the original.
I've got a file of old stuff, as you might have gathered from this evening. So I'll definitely put it in with that. Thanks so much.
Sure.
And thank you and Walker for coming out tonight and sharing your reminiscences of our group and some of its best days. And hope that you all continue to come back. You know, we do this every month, so.
Thank both of you for all you did to get us kickstarted.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Y'all want to
Bill,
carry
too.
on.
Bill, too. Thanks, Bill.
Well, as I made clear, I was not in on it until it was well underway, so.
Well, thank you everybody for sharing, really appreciate it.
Okay.
Supervisor, ever throw dandelion at you? Do you have a photograph that I can get from you to send to Michael? I don't think he's got it.
I can send you that.
Would you
It's
mind?
electronic, yeah.
Yeah.
It's right out of the Sky Telescope, 1960.
I wanted to ask
Want
you.
my email address?
Yeah.
What happened to Dandelion?
Yeah, we have a question.
Yeah. Dandelion? Well, Dandelion, stayed at the Snowden house for about 2.5 years until it started getting so big that the neighbors were complaining. Things, dogs were missing and so forth.
Astronomer.
It really wasn't due to Dandelion, but what happened, Michael went off to college and his brothers were going to college too, so what they did, down in South Haven, there was a private zoo down there. And they donated that to the private zoo, and about 2 years or 3 years after that, Michael was in town, and I happened to be in town at the same time. He said, let's go see Dandelion. So we went down there, and sure enough, there was Dandelion in the cage, and Mike just got in the cage with Dandelion, and Danny knew. He says, come on in, Buhler. I said, no. He knows. So that's the last I saw of him. Yeah, all right.
That was one kitty cat and dogs and
I'll never forget that thing purring in that dome. It's like a Black Hawk helicopter. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions for the experts here that don't assemble them in one place that often?
A lot of history.
Yeah.
I need a picture with the 3 dinosaurs, or graveyards.
We're gonna do this I'll have to stand up here.
Where are you gonna go? Yeah, we can get all kinds of light.
You guys are dismissed, by the way.
I'm glad, hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you tomorrow night in the observing session, and if you come to Village Tree, come on down.
It's all.
Yeah, we'll talk to you later. Take care. Actually, that's very good right there.
History, yeah.
Sure, thank you. This is fun, I guess.
John Buhler, did you ever get this?
Remember your name from back there. Bill?
My son came in
Sure,
town.
glad you
He
did.
was before their eyes.
Yeah, well, I didn't know. Yeah. Yeah. Now it's her father.
How are you?
All right. Assisted living, it's down on this, but I'm sure we'll, come back. Here every month.
Thank you.
We don't normally go on this.
Oh, a lot of detail.
I sure will. Bill? Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay.
Not the history, but yeah. Following him in organizations been around this long.
All I have is your email.
Oh, I'm gonna say yes, but I don't have a working cell phone, really, but I can give you the phone number. 302-246. And my cell phone, I haven't had it on, it's rare, 412-7692.
Great question.
But it doesn't work at home, so I don't give it out, just people call, send messages and everything, so I just leave it on.
Goes on our channel. You know the link to our channel, right?
Yeah, sure.